Welcome to Cyber Focus from the McCrary Institute, where we explore the people and ideas shaping and defending our digital world. I'm your host, Frank Cilluffo, and this week I have the privilege to sit down with Bob Kolasky. Bob is a senior vice president at Exeter, a company focused on supply chain related issues and supply chain risk. Prior to joining Exeter, Bob was a long-time and original plank holder at what is now CISA, previously NPPD, and prior to that, the preparedness director at the Department of Homeland Security. Bob also stood up the National Risk Management Center at CISA, and really excited to sit down with Bob today on supply chain, and supply chain. Bob, great to see you. Thanks for joining us today. So, supply chain is finding its day in the sun, in part because there's some breaking news at the time we're discussing here, pagers in Lebanon and the like. But I thought before we jump into that particular event and incident, we can maybe sit back and sort of paint a picture on where we are today from a supply chain perspective. I know Congress, and notably through the committee focused on the Communist Party of China, has passed 25 bills, passed the House. Yeah. On supply chain related issues. So I'd love to sort of get your thoughts on where we are and what we need to be thinking about right now.
Yeah, and I think the events that recently happened in Lebanon and the attack on Hezbollah terrorists is part of this conversation, because I think part of what we're saying with supply chain is it is part of a hybrid threat environment, hybrid risk environment, and certainly when you get closer to instruments of war and whether we're going to call things war or close to war, terror attacks and everything, supply chain is increasingly become both an important element of how nations defend themselves, but also an area of attack. This is a cyber podcast, and supply chain supplies, digital supplies, are a key attack vector by which cyber attacks are deployed. But of course, the term supply chain existed before the term cyber did, right? Because supply chains, logistics chains, that's how parts get delivered. That's how products get delivered in the middle of a disaster response or in the middle of conflict. Something gets from somewhere to somewhere else through a supply chain, through having a supply base. And so when you talk about the issue now and why we care about supply chains, we care because we want to have safe and secure supply chains. We don't want them to be vectors of attack. Certainly for those of us who are in the Homeland Security perspective, we want to minimize attacks via supply chain attacks and the like, but we also want them to function to get critical goods to where they need to get, to help with national defense, to help with the delivery of national critical functions and the like. So supply chains are an important element. What we're going to talk about, critical infrastructure, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
Right? Supply chains are an important element to enable critical infrastructure, but they also present a risk vector to critical infrastructure and other instruments.
And I guess a lot of the attention early on was more in the exploit or espionage side of the house. So in addition to disruptive or destructive attacks, which there are some as well, largely we're talking, at least initially, you don't want Intel inside, as the old Intel commercial used to go.
So let's talk about SolarWinds, which I'm sure you've talked about on this podcast, as a supply chain attack. And SolarWinds was a software supply chain attack where they exploited bad code that was knowingly exploitable by Russia in there, and they exploited that code to collect information that's as far as we understand, to collect information on U.S. government sources, U.S. government agencies, and any other sources that they could use related to this SolarWinds vulnerability. And so, think about SolarWinds, not both as a cyber attack and a supply chain attack. And of course, what that means by calling them two different things is you have to mitigate through multiple ways, or there's opportunity to mitigate through multiple ways.
And before going, and we can go deep on SolarWinds as well, but what about DJI? This was a manufacturer of drones and unmanned vehicles. Lots of concern. You and I had discussions when you were in that role at CISA. What do we need to take away from there?
As you know, I was at CISA through 2022, and going back, when we stood up the National Risk Management Center in 2018, one of the first issues we were talking about was what to do with concerns about DJI. DJI is a Chinese company that has cornered a significant portion of the U.S. Law enforcement drone market, right? And we saw, even going back to 2018, 2019, and the Department of Defense has identified these technically exploitable vulnerabilities associated with the use of DJI drones. And what that means is concerns about the company, the Chinese government, collecting information through the use of those drones. There's also the reality that since, so I mean, I think that's the major concern there, right? That not only do we know there's ties, but at least DJI is subject to the laws of China and can be influenced by the Chinese government.
I think that's the issue, right?
But there are also technical vulnerabilities related to that. So this is a risk that's staring us in the face, has been for a long time. One of the 25 bills you mentioned that from the Chinese, the CCP committee was to address DJI drones, but they're still out there. They're still the dominant drone being bought by law enforcement across the U.S.
Which is kind of frustrating because I think I wrote my first op-ed about 10 years on this particular issue, and I kind of feel like it's almost a whack-a-mole approach. ZPMC is now the concerns about cranes and ports, all of which is good that we're getting our arms around this, but do we have visibility across our supply chains?
We don't have the visibility that we need to have, but
at the granular level,
but
right?
You mentioned Exeter, my company right now. Amongst the things we do is help add to visibility, illuminate supply chains, and that can be done by the collection of a lot of information that's available open source and through other data sources to knit together supply chain, how supply chains work, supplier relationships. But visibility can always get better. Companies need to invest in visibility in their own supply chain. The U.S. government needs to know, particularly around weapon systems and the like, visibility in supply chains. And then there's parts of the U.S. government, like my old agency CISA, who are interested in visibility just because they want to know where risk may lie in the supply chain. Going to the DJI question, and I mean, I think this is an interesting conversation of like, okay, this is not a new issue, but yet it hasn't
been
got
fully
to the
addressed.
point. Yes, and we are accepting the risk as a country associated with DJI drones. State and local law enforcement offices around the country are accepting the risk known with DJI drones. The information's out there, so now we have to say they're accepting the risk, and the reason they're accepting the risk is DJI is the most cost-effective and efficient solution that they can find. So even if you don't want to necessarily deploy DJI drones, they perform well for efficiency and effectiveness reasons. The other half of mitigating supply chain risk is having an alternative supply base that is more trustworthy. So it's not just illuminating, seeing visibility in supply chains. It's like, how are we as a country going to see the investments made in alternatives to DJI so that law enforcement can still get a cost-effective solution to meet their mission needs?
And isn't that exactly what we were dealing with rural broadband, for example, and Huawei and other sorts of issues?
We can go down the list of things we're dealing with. I mean, there were good and bad reasons that we are overly reliant on technology that comes from
elsewhere.
This did not all happen from some intentionality that I think even on the Chinese side that there was we're going to create technical dominance in certain industries because we want to use that for espionage or other reasons. But that's sort of what happened. And we're not going to talk on this podcast about trade and going back to most favored nation status and WTO rules and things like that. But we are going to, or we're going to talk about sort of in any depth the technical wherewithal you need to manufacture this stuff and create it. But we have got to an uneasy place as a country, and I think both Democrats and Republicans, a lot of what Congress is trying to do is roll back, and what both the Biden administration and the Trump administration before it roll back some of that for national security and national economic competitive reasons.
I actually don't think that issue's off piece or off grounds. The reality is when you look at cyber issues, it's not just the beep and squeak and the technological sets of issues and subject matter experts who need a seat at the table. It really is all instruments of statecraft, and supply chain in particular gets a little confusing because it's both physical and cyber. And you can have a cyber attack that has a kinetic and physical outcome, and you can have a physical attack on cyber infrastructure that leads to that same sort of outcome. So I actually don't think that's off grounds, because we do need to marshal and mobilize our community to address this, no?
Yeah, no, I agree. And you and I have talked over the years about sort of economic security as part of homeland security, economic security, national security.
They're all inextricably interwoven, aren't they?
Processes to talk through those, having the seat at the table. I believe now at this point, the term industrial policy is no longer off table to talk about here in Washington. And I think both, again, going back to the legislative action, I think there are aspects of industrial policy that are part of that to strengthen our nation's security, to strengthen our economic competitiveness, to make us more cyber secure, and ultimately for America's national interest. It's not just about bringing supplies back here, manufacturing back to the U.S.
as much as you can.
But there's friendshoring and trust shoring and such, and making sure that there are the instruments of power are used to stimulate the development of technologies and markets for technologies that are crucial, and that critical supply chains, critical supplies, there's trust in critical supplies and critical supply chains. That's the end state goal. We're going to layer cybersecurity on top of that amongst the trust factors is strong software, strong hardware, continuous monitoring against known exploitable vulnerabilities, not having backdoors entered into things 0 days, and all that, which is all part of it, building up a strong supply chain.
So let's go to, we discussed briefly the Select Committee on CCP, let's just call it the China Select Committee, and they recently came out with a report that also included Mark Green at House Homeland and transportation, I believe, as well, looking at ports and looking in particular at ZPMC. Thoughts around that? There's themes in all of these stories. ZPMC was a provider of communications technologies is a provider deployed through cranes, ship-to-shore cranes at ports around the country that, again, had established dominant market position. And just for a lay audience, what could that mean if you have a majority of these cranes in sensitive U.S. ports?
A lot traffics through cranes, a lot. So understanding through ports, not through cranes, pardon me. What can it mean?
Collection.
Ports are critical infrastructure. Ports have, you see lots of things that go out. So yes, starts with collecting different sources of collecting information about shipping patterns, what kind of goods are through ports, timing and what ships from that. And so it is a collection vehicle. There are other ways, of course, that could be, but it's in addition to digital espionage capabilities. And then always with these things, there's also the possibility that there's availability issues, something goes wrong, systems don't work, and we're in the middle of a bad day where we have to try to deploy overseas from the stuff that's going to help us get overseas from a port, and we have operational issues there. And so I think to the report, it identified that this is a risk factor that has continued to increase. And are we ready to go after doing it? You see a lot of this in all these things where it's like it's time to, we've elevated the risk, but we don't have solutions yet. And the report's
or
trying
costs.
Trying to put pressure on the port environment for solutions.
Yeah, just to sort of pull a thread you raised. So there's the collection concern, but there's also the in the event of a crisis, it may not work as intended. Yeah. And if you can exploit, you can disrupt or attack, right? Arguably.
Yeah, and the last several years of my career at DHS and then work I've done after was all about better understanding strategic vulnerabilities to critical functions. And, I used to give
and help our listeners understand that and viewers, because critical functions, exactly.
The idea of critical functions are the things that infrastructure produces that are important to national security, the economy, economic security. So the critical function that we all rely on is generating electricity, distributing electricity, and transmitting electricity. So we have the lights on every day. It's the health and public health system. It's patient care. Critical functions include the supply of water. It includes, having a functioning wireless communications network. And so the idea of switching from from critical functions to just talking about critical infrastructure sectors is it's actually the thing that we want to make sure works is the function that the infrastructure produces. And so it's not just the actual piece of critical infrastructure, it's the critical function.
That could cut across all critical infrastructure sectors, right?
Like all critical infrastructure sectors.
Bleed over.
Rely on critical minerals. They rely on the availability of chemicals and the ability to process chemicals. They rely on, of course, electricity there. And so going back to the question of the concern with ports, and what I was saying about my time at DHS, we realized at a certain point that if our adversaries of concern are nation states who have time to invest in ways to try to go after weakening the homeland, weakening America's critical infrastructure or critical functions, they're going to be studying the ways to do that, and we have to know our systems better than they know our systems so we can make protection prioritizations. And it really is a mindset shift if ultimately the goal of Homeland Security is to maintain the continuity of critical functions, the continuity of government and the like, to work toward that and protect it and make resilient those critical functions, and think about the things that are most precious in how that works and make sure those are protection priorities.
And can you help our viewers understand sort of, you've got critical infrastructure sectors, you've got critical functions, you've got what are now referred to as SIEs, systemically important entities. Help us stitch that together.
It's a messy, it doesn't have to be sort of a messy bureaucratic effort, and it's kind of fun to talk about the messy bureaucratic elements of it because it's important to know that. But ultimately, the end state goal in my mind is maintaining functions, whether at the national level or at the community level, that are safe and secure, that work there. And to do that, you have to work with critical infrastructure companies, critical infrastructure industries, through a sector structure to strengthen critical infrastructure, to strengthen critical functions. And within that, then there are important elements, data centers,
which, by the way,
transformers,
the Brits
ports.
Just defined as a equivalent of a critical infrastructure sector.
The financial parts of the financial instrument, telecom, hotels, and the like, which are sort of systemically important to the overall functioning of how our infrastructure works. And that's what the systemically important entities are entities that operate things that are the crucial nodes to keep functions up and running. And so what I would advocate the government do, and I tried to do a lot of this when I was in government, and it's a big government, they don't always listen to what I'm advocating for, but what I would advocate for is knowing the most systemically important entities and working with those companies that operate that infrastructure as close as possible. We can say operational collaboration, we can say shoulder to shoulder to them, but as close as possible to strengthen those, to prioritize making sure that those entities have everything they need from the government, and that there's constant communication so that risks are recognized and vulnerabilities are addressed because it's in the national interest.
And also because many of these companies didn't go into business thinking they have to defend themselves against foreign militaries, foreign intelligence services, and the like.
I agree that that's true, but I had the honor of working with representatives of many of these companies. At the point, I had the honor to work with a bunch of people in government who I trust and respect a lot. And at some point, if you're systemically important, you know you're systemically important. There was one company who said, "Hey, we're trying to decide if we're systemically important." Like it was up to them. And it's like, well, no, you're systemically important because your business has been so successful that you do something that's so important to American communities and the like, that you have the honor to be systemically important, but you have the obligation to be systemically important, right? So you might not have entered because you thought you were going to one day be crucial to national security or national well-being, but through the success of your business, you are.
Which brings up a question around, which has probably come up in multiple podcasts, but space cloud, thoughts on that? Should they be designated critical infrastructure sectors, clearly essential to our national security economy and public health?
So there's part of this which is an academic discussion, which is like, okay, cloud infrastructure, particularly hyperscale cloud infrastructure, is part of our critical infrastructure. If you're one of the hyperscalers, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, that's not a controversial statement whatsoever. Other parts of that ecosystem certainly are. So the question of should it be a separate critical infrastructure sector, or how should the requirements be, the security and resilience requirements to be placed on them, that's the question we should be dealing with. The last question, which is, do we need additional security and resilience requirements or practices or put in place to make sure that what is critical infrastructure
and do we?
Is, in areas we do. We certainly need more what I call stress testing of the use of cloud services, for example, preparedness exercising, making sure that we know, as we saw this with the impact of the CrowdStrike and the failure of the software update in the CrowdStrike. We saw the degree to which the entire ecosystem depends on the real-time upping of systems, and CSPs are a big part of that.
Yeah. So let's move to sort of what U.S. strategies are to respond. And again, I think we frame this different ways, but at the end of the day, our cybersecurity and economic security are inextricably interwoven, and our cybersecurity and national security, same sort of thing. But where do you think we stand right now?
On
some of the at least strategically thinking through strategies around supply chain and securing, and more importantly, doing the securing of supply chains.
Again, we've made a lot of progress on the recognition side, on the putting this toward the top of agenda.
So admiring problems, we're there.
But that kind of progress, let's think simply binary. Companies are taking their supply chain security, their supply chain risk management more seriously than they used to. They're investing in resilience in their supply chains because it's good business there, and they recognize the need to do that. Would like to continue to elevate that conversation from the private sector side to make sure that private sector supply chain risk management, particularly for critical infrastructure companies, is an important part of how they execute their business. Every dollar invested in security comes at a cost, but it also hopefully reduces risk and contributes to the bottom line. From the government side, the government has created more, certainly the executive branch has created more institutional strength, governance structures to address these issues. We haven't quite seen the full benefit of that, so there needs to be a little bit of continuity in solutions there. But then the legislative push, the CHIPS and Science Act, the Infrastructure Investment in the Inflation Reduction Act, that's given us more money to strengthen our supply base. I think the Biden administration's EO, America's Supply Chain EO, which was probably the first security EO coming out of the administration, has identified critical supply areas, and we're starting to see strengthening of the energy supply chain, the healthcare supply chain, the mineral supply chain, and investments in that. But that's almost a generational problem.
And again, I still think we have a challenge with visibility when you get to second, third, fourth order kind of effect of supply chains. So,
well, let's start with, and this happens all the time, right? More visibility, more demands for visibility to require critical infrastructure companies, government agencies to not put their head in the sand and to avoid the visibility. So get the visibility because it's good for you to manage your supply chain risks. And so I think...
And some of that's not government. It's going to be clearly industry, right?
And there are solutions that will help companies better understand the supply chain. And as you have that visibility, start to use that visibility to make decisions to take less risk, to find alternative suppliers, to not have concentration risk, and to then go advocate where, again, go back to the DJI drone. If you really rely on drones and the only place you seem to be able to find drones from is DJI, let's have let's have a national conversation about how we create alternative sources of drones.
No, that's spot on, and I do think there are a number of different areas. I always feel like we're reacting rather than trying to get out in front of all that. And what are your thoughts on that?
So it's never the list of the companies to not do business with or the list of companies to do business with. It's having the process to create those lists and update those lists.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
but there should be a unifying list, should there not?
Depending on the purpose, there should be. Yeah. There should certainly be. There may not be one list to rule them all for everything, but there should certainly be, if all the lists are trying to do kind of similar things, why not do that in a unified way? And certainly from my industry perspective, I get frustrated when there's 7 different ways that the government's trying to accomplish the same different thing that I have to comply with. Give me one way that I comply with what you're trying to accomplish, because it's going to be much more cost effective.
So it's more than just harmonizing, it's actually getting on the same sheet of music.
Yeah,
some of this.
And so we can roll out, like, don't do business with Huawei, don't do business with ZTE, don't do business with Kaspersky. That's good, and there are legitimate reasons not to do business with them and not to have that hardware and software and parts in your supply chain. But that process has to be dynamic. So, because these companies, the Chinese government, the Russian government, this is a ongoing game, right? This is, so, okay, if we pass a law to don't do business with A and B, and we think one reason don't do business with A and B is they're influenced by China or Russia, that guess what? There's going to be an alternative to A and B that the Chinese government is subsidizing or the Russian government's subsidizing.
Which is a bit of a whack-a-mole.
Yeah, which is why the process has to be dynamic, and there needs to be continuous monitoring of supply chain risk.
So one particular entity that gets a whole lot of attention, you and I have probably had discussions about this over the years, but let's talk TikTok, ByteDance, and what the implications are there.
Yeah, I continue to think that the legislative path that we're on, and the and the restrictions placed on ByteDance's ability to operate TikTok in the U.S. is a good path. I think it is clear that TikTok gives the Chinese government avenue for propaganda in the U.S. We can have a conversation about free speech and propaganda, but when a country that's been designated an adversary nation has that much influence over a media platform, I think it's in our interest to for that not to occur.
Yeah, Mike Gallagher used to call it digital fentanyl, which it kind of is.
And so there are then intelligence conversations about what else can be collected via TikTok, whether it's
geolocation,
information, geolocation, and some of that, I think it's fair to criticize the government for not being exactly clear about how far they're concerned about the collection possibilities related to TikTok. Some of that's because those conversations are happening in maybe not in rooms like this. But I think, creating an ecosystem where there are alternatives to TikTok to accomplish what a lot of people like out of TikTok, so that we're not so reliant on a social media platform that is digital media platform that's so reliant, that's so connected to the Chinese government is a worthwhile goal.
And again, you brought this up earlier, but it's even if the company doesn't have malicious intent, it is bound by law to share information with the security services of.
And I think that's an important element of this whole supply chain conversation. Like, there are first-order realities if you do business as an incorporated company in China or in Russia. Both of them have laws that say, if we as a government say we want a piece of information about your business, your client base, your clients, you legally have to comply with that. Imagine if that was the debate here in the U.S. and if American companies had to operate basically at the fear at any one day that they were working on behalf of the government without control there. And, that's not a policy you or I would advocate here in the U.S. It's bad policy, but it's a sign of what an authoritarian government is doing. And the reality is that puts anything that those companies are doing, even if they're not directly subsidized or run by the government, that puts a degree of influence and potentially control of their business practices. And a lot of what we're trying to roll back in the supply chain is not being reliant on places that are the first order are serving the needs of our adversaries.
And I would argue financial transparency. So with 10K file, none of that exists. And to know where the funding originated and what other intentions may be are pretty difficult to discern.
Yeah, and so there are places where, it's relatively clear that these companies are complying with the law of the CCP or the Russian government, and there are other places where there's startup culture and things like that, but there's risk there.
Mm-hmm. So you got 25 bills passed in the House. Obviously, it needs to pass the Senate to move forward. Anything lacking in that you feel like major gaps still exist that you would have liked to have seen? And if you have, and I'm not asking you to be a betting man, but which ones do you think actually make it over the goal line?
I mean, you never lose money betting against Congress passing bills, right? The fact that the TikTok bill got done was a big deal. There's not much time in this Congress for things. It's hard to see the DJI bill getting done, but maybe I'm wrong in the Senate. But there are things like.
But these have largely bipartisan support.
I mean, we haven't talked about the Biosecure Act,
and that's a big deal.
We haven't talked about the Biosecure Act, which is one of those 25 that does have, has been passed, right? And the Biosecure Act is protecting the bioeconomy, biohealth, sensitive health information that is being collected in companies that are doing business there. Again, I don't get paid as a prognosticator for particular ones. I think things that are moving toward protecting the most critical information, I think there is recognition that amongst sensitive information that particularly overlaps with Americans losing their own sensitive information, such as what we're talking about with the Biosecure Act, there's that you can talk to your constituents about what you're trying to do there. And I think those ones where, it's like anything with Congress. It's like if it's going to serve the needs of constituents, it's got more of a chance of passing.
And if you look back just to the pandemic and responses to COVID-19, and we talked ports, we talked medical supply chains and the like, we were in part dependent. And honestly, China was not acting in our best interest throughout that, which I'm sure if the shoes were flipped.
Yeah, I mean, there were some realities, things that shipped out of Wuhan and things that just were not available, and that's just because we weren't shipping things from there. And we saw from an ICT functioning that the ICT companies were able to continue operations despite not getting parts that they were relying on, but that there were times it teetered in terms of the actual PPE, medical personnel protective equipment,
deal at the time.
MCMs. Yes, that we did not have the capacity that we needed.
And other medical
early days there, and even when capacity started to come back online, you also saw a lot of counterfeit goods being shipped from different places. You saw a lot of fraud in the system as well. So it wasn't just a matter of, could we get these things, but could we get
the real thing?
Counterfeit PPE, counterfeit medicine means it doesn't work, right?
Yep.
It means it's not performing its critical function of keeping people safe.
Yeah.
And then we haven't even talked about the dangerous in the fentanyl supply chain,
and that is a big deal. And I do want to get to that maybe in a different kind of way. But when you look at convergence, physical cyber, supply chain cyber, but biotech, and you brought up sort of the Biosafety Act and cyber. They're coming together pretty darn fast, aren't they?
Oh yeah. How is all this right? One of the reasons we're having this conversation is the digitalization of how supply chains operate, in the automated way, and that things are being produced, and the fact that we're more reliant on artificial intelligence and robotics and the computing power necessary for all that. So innovation, right? That even in things that you think are the most, classic physical manufacturing of things. There's still a digital element of innovation to how to do
advanced
that.
manufacturing's huge.
Yeah, right. So we're seeing order of magnitudes improvements in manufacturing techniques that are being enabled by digital. And whenever you say the word digital, you can say the word cyber, because a digital supply chain is a potentially cyber vulnerable supply chain. And that's means cybersecurity's got to go to those areas. And, we're merging all these concepts together. The physical implications of the supply chain not functioning because of a digital failure has real world consequences, whether on your business bottom line or the availability of the good that my city is dependent on.
Let's go to breaking news today, which will not be necessarily when our viewers touch on this, but significant supply chain issue that brings to real life the potential consequences, and let's talk about what we saw or seeing play out in Lebanon.
So, by all accounts, the Israeli intelligence operation launched an exquisite attack on members of Hezbollah using supply chains, and it's there are three elements that I think are worth talking about just right now: intelligence and the degree to which this was from everything I can tell, was a well-planned intelligence operation where suppliers, companies who were providing pagers were set up for the intent of providing pagers that could be used in this manner. And so this took time to build up a supply base, and companies that were essentially front companies or the like, to then, Hezbollah procured from these companies, right? And a good, a bad of the attack is these pagers were set up to be in the hands of terrorists or people who support terrorists, and not just sent out into the wild in Lebanon. So that took time. So this was an exquisite intelligence operation. The second side is the technological side, which we've been talking about throughout this, which is I would imagine it's pretty hard to get all the specifics right for the degree of technological attacks, where there's explosives and ways to a charge and a way to generate the explosives to cause this level of harm. And then the third area is what I think you and I would call doctrine, right? We've now seen in a near state of war, supply chain attack be part of the Israeli government's doctrine for something that's a way that you can go about attacking the adversary. I'm not aware of a lot of examples like that. We'll see if anything changes long term about that as an instrument, but it's all part of every conflict between modern states and modern states and modern states. But it's going to be a hybrid conflict now. That's what Russia-Ukraine has been. That's what certainly even the Hamas attack on Israel was a hybrid technologically enabled attack, even though we would assume Hamas is not as far advanced in some of the exquisite intelligence capabilities we're talking about, but still it was a highly technical, highly sophisticated hybrid attack against
So in terms of scale and scope, arguably unprecedented. In terms of the tradecraft, the tactics, techniques, and procedures, I think you're seeing, and again, there's a lot we don't know, but in all likelihood, a combination of sophisticated human intelligence combined with technical means.
Yes.
And
creative planning.
And very creative and unique planning that had significant consequence. The question I think that all of us have sort of struggled with in the past is we've always had sophisticated cyber capabilities, but there's always the potential that once you unleash something, it can boomerang and come back. Do you think this is potentially going to lead to that, or is the tradecraft at such an exquisite and sophisticated means that probably not so much?
I mean, there's this sort of somewhat flippant part of it, like, should I be worried about carrying my cell phone today? Should me and you be worried about our cell phone? Or if we have a pager, I haven't had a pager for a little while. Luckily, I don't spend time in skiffs anymore. But haven't had so there's a little bit of that, is this exact, there are reasons why people shouldn't wake up and be scared about their personal communication device today. That being said, over time, is it a attack vector that can be put in place? We've now seen that it is. Are others going to try to copycat and pursue it? You know, that's the doctrinal piece. Maybe it's not off limits to try to do that. And so, you know, I do think from a homeland security perspective, we've been talking about supply chain risk management, but let's also talk about supply chain security. And it's going to be important for things that are potential weapons, that you know the provenance of the things that are potential weapons, that you're maintaining checks on the integrity there, that, you know, if you're in the U.S. Defense Department or somewhere, you're making sure who you're doing business with and where you're buying these things with is you're continuously monitoring all the things we were talking about earlier there. You know, I don't know that Hezbollah has the ability to know that who they're buying pagers from is secure, but the U.S. Defense Department probably has the ability to put practices in there. And so, too, we're going to have to see this on the corporate security side. And so, yeah, I mean, as an escalation technique for something that has to be now part of your planning, I think, unfortunately, we always have to learn from these and plan for whether that's a scenario, where it's going to lead for, you know, Hezbollah's response. And did Israel escalate to de-escalate, or did Israel escalate to escalate? You know, this is running 2 weeks before. We're talking 2 weeks before this is going to run.
But the technique from a collection standpoint, I don't think any of us would be overly surprised that it could be exploited. But also to ensure how it was detonated and heated up and what have you, there was some pretty sophisticated
and one amongst the things that you and I don't know is how easy would it be for us to evaluate a piece of technology if we were looking for a scenario like this. You know, presumably it's probably worth assuming that it was not easy to spot, but if you were explicitly looking for explosives, you know, and so there will be questions. Unfortunately, you know, going back to DHS and the DHS mission, there are going to be questions about bombing detection, explosive detection, technology to improve explosive detection, areas that DHS has invested in great R&D over the last 20 years, but will continue to be something that, you know, we're going to have to see investments in. Hey,
Bob, we're near unfortunately, the end of our time. Sure. What questions didn't I ask that I should have?
I think you pretty much hit them for what we're trying to do here with supply chain security.
Let me ask it a different way. Yeah. Unfinished business. You long and terrific career in federal service. Anything in particular you'd love to see in 5 years acted upon?
Stability of institutions, I think, is important, and stability of priorities. And so, you know, I always come at this, and we're talking a little bit, you know, we're doing some work, Frank, on, you know, cyber priorities for the next administration, whether it's the Harris administration or the Trump administration. And one of the things I think we both agree on is, you know, let's not keep changing institutional directions. Let's empower the institutions that Congress has created, that the executive branch has created, to continue to do this work. Administrations may have different priorities, but the more we sort of jump around with three-letter agencies who have different authorities and all that, and the more we keep creating something new, the more we sort of get drawn away from the end state goal, which is more security and resilience. Pithy thing I always say is every dollar you're spending on change or compliance rather than security resilience is, you know, those things come at a trade-off.
Opportunity costs.
Right. And so I want to see, you know, we didn't spend as much time as we probably could have in sort of how the government better empowers the private sector to provide capabilities around some of these things. That's certainly an area of passion for me. You need government reform, you need procurement reform, you need some of those areas to continue to allow the private sector to be the source of innovation on these issues.
And I think many want to, right? I mean, they're just chomping at the bit, actually.
Yeah. I mean, we were talking before starting. You just talked to Dave DeWalt and Catherine Grunberg, and you know the work they're doing at Night Dragon. I mean, they're investing in companies who want to be part of the national security solution. Certainly, that's we as a company are, you know, think we can help get us stay ahead of some of these challenges, and that's how we're going to win this. But they have to become with trusted suppliers.
Bob, Thank you for all your time today. Thank you for your many years of public service, and thank you for continuing to serve. And I dare say, as a senior fellow, we're thrilled to have you on board at the McCrary Institute.
Thrilled to be here, and luckily we're going to have lots of issues to talk about it coming forward.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Bob. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Cyber Focus. If you liked what you heard, please consider subscribing. Your ratings and reviews help us reach more listeners. Drop us a line if you have any ideas in terms of topics, themes, or individuals you'd like for us to host. Until next time, stay safe, stay informed, and stay curious.